about, or we're going to go over, what can be considered one of the most stressful type of calls that you'll run into in the EMS field, and that's the call involving multiple casualty incidents or mass casualty incidents. So up until now, you've kind of learned about assessing a single individual patient, whether it be trauma or medical, and doing it in a very linear, step-by-step, comprehensive way. Well, when you're talking about incidents that involve multiple patients where demand for services outweigh the resources available, then you kind of have to break the rules a little bit, and you have to try to do the most good for the most amount of people. And unfortunately, you're not going to save as many lives as you would hope to. So what's the term multiple casualty incident? It's not really dependent on any one number of patients. It could be 5 patients, it could be 20 patients, but it's an incident that places a great demand on EMS equipment and personnel. Quite often, the majority of these incidents involve motor vehicle collisions, but they could involve structural fires, explosions, hazardous material incidents, sporting events. What happened in Israel just recently, it was at a gathering and a big stampede leading to about 45 people being crushed to death. A similar incident occurred at City College when I first started EMS back in the early 90s. The bottom line is your initial priority is not patient care. Your initial priority is setting up an incident command and staging the ambulance in a safe place and sorting your patients out from people of highest priority to lowest priority. And there's a kind of a system to do that. And it involves the incident management system, which you kind of learned about a little bit in your hazmat training. Incident management provides orderly means for communication and decision making, and involves interaction between agencies, which is easier with a unified command. So when you have multiple agencies responding on the scene, law enforcement, fire suppression, EMS, you may also have federal agencies as well, FBI, you may have environmental protection services, you may have a number of different agencies. It's important to follow a chain of command so that there's no confusion and there's easy transition between providers. So what's the initial role of the EMT during the MCI? Well, first things first is to size up the scene, resist the temptation to become a hero. Provide a calm radio report of the situation and request resources. That's easier said than done. You have firefighters pulling people or pulling children out of a burning building who are on their last breath trying to throw you in your arms and tell you to take them to the hospital. That's not what you're going to do. You're not there to treat and transport initially. Now, if you're the first arriving unit, you are the most stressed out unit, but hopefully that will not happen for long. Once you recognize that it's a potential for a multiple casualty incident, call for additional resources earlier than later. Better you call for them early and cancel them if they're not needed than neglect calling for them and need them and then be stuck. You want to organize your resources into incident management system, including various treatment sectors like extrication, who's going to be pulling patients away from the site, triage, which means sorting patients according to their priority, staging, making sure the ambulances are set in a place where they have easy access to the patients, but also an easy way of getting out of there when they have to transport the patients. Make sure that the ambulances are in an area where they're not trapped in or blocked in by fire trucks or military trucks. A certain area specifically for treatment of injured patients on the scene. A certain area that's going to facilitate transport to proper hospitals. You can't have one hospital, just the closest 911 hospital, overwhelmed with all these incoming ambulances. It may be appropriate to divvy them up, to send some patients to trauma centers, some patients to burn centers, some patients to the local 911 centers. And usually that's a function of the transportation officer is once on scene to reach out to all the local hospitals and see what they're capable of handling. The supply sector, making sure that we have enough oxygen tanks, backboards, stretchers, burn kits, just name it. And then finally, command. Even at the basic level, if you're first on the scene, you're going to be setting up medical command until you're relieved by your superiors, whether it's in the fire department, by the lieutenants or captains, or by your own agency. Every different agency has a little bit of a different protocol and method for how to implement these procedures. So let's get familiar with this term triage. You probably heard that term before. It's a French word that means to sort, to kind of divvy up. So for example, when you go to the emergency room and it's a crowded emergency room, you're not necessarily seen on a first come, first served basis. If you're going to the emergency room for a badly sprained ankle, you'll need to be seen, but the person clutching their chest and sweating profusely is going to be seen before you, even if you were waiting an hour or two before them, because it goes based on how serious you are. Well, it's kind of the same thing that happens on a multiple casualty incident. We evaluate and treat patients definitively based on how serious they are. And there's a level of priorities that are established. It says here there are 3 levels. There's actually kind of 4, but you don't want to be the 4th one. So your first job is to rapidly assess each patient into a treatment priority. You're actually doing very, very little patient care when you are triaging, only securing an airway or stopping any major bleeding. A more thorough treatment begins after all patients are triaged. So you're going to run through whatever amount of patients you're going to have. You're going to decide who's the most stable, who's the least stable, who are basically deceased, and who's in between. And you're going to just make that assessment, and then you're going to move on. Make the next assessment and move on to the next. And hopefully within very little amount of time, secondary and tertiary and backup units will be coming by, which will reassess and then retriage and then finally take over treatment and transport. So let's look at this scenario. So you respond to an overturned bus. You have about 50 people on that bus involved in all sorts of different injuries. Some are walking towards you, some are lying on the floor, moaning and groaning and screaming. Some people appear lifeless. How do you assess the situation? How do you sort it out? Well, theoretically, it's a very difficult situation. Let's talk about the most serious people, all right? The highest priority, or what we call priority 1 first. These are people that are about to die. They have issues with the airway, breathing, circulation, or their mental status. Their brains are not working. Their airways are compromised. They are breathing inadequately. They are bleeding uncontrollably, or they're showing definitive signs of shock, or the mental status is crashing. We designate these as priority 1 or red tags. We'll describe what that means in a moment. Priority 2 are your serious patients, but who are somewhat stable, yet burns without airway problems, major or multiple lung bone or joint injuries, spinal injuries, things that are going to make them definitely need definitive medical treatment, but they can wait a little bit. They'll have to be retriaged, rescreened. We call that yellow tag. And again, don't get caught up on that just yet. Your lowest priority, theoretically, would be what's called your walking wounded. These are the people that were able to get up from that incident, walk towards you, scream, complain, help each other up. It's basically theoretically that if they're walking wounded, their injuries are minor, and that their care can be delayed. Now, could that change down the line? Absolutely. Okay, that's why we have a primary screening, a secondary screening, a subsequent screening, because situations may change and need to be triaged and then re-triaged. Now, I say that really is the lowest priority. Priority 4, or sometimes what's called priority 0, are your fatally injured or fatally affected individual. These are patients who are in cardiac arrest or have injuries that are incompatible with life. Now, what's different about an MCI as opposed to any other type of call is that in an MCI, multiple casualty incident, CPR is not done. I know that sounds cold and heartless and contrary to what we've been doing all semester, but let's look at the cold, hard stats. Very rarely will somebody who's in especially traumatic cardiac arrest be resuscitated. The numbers are just not good. So if you're going to spend 2, 3, 4 people trying to resuscitate somebody on the scene that statistically has almost a 0% chance of surviving, and divert those resources to people who are critically injured and critically ill, who are alive and have the potential to be saved, you're not doing the most good for the most amounts of people. So when we evaluate all these patients, we use the method called START, simple triage and rapid treatment. It's based on very, very easy to remember and strictly logical, cold logic criteria, which involves a quick 30-second evaluation of each patient utilizing the parameters of just their respiration, their pulse, and their mental status. That's the only 3 things you care about during your initial triage of a multiple casualty incident: respirations, pulse, and mental status. You should remember that. So, for example, during simple triage and rapid treatment, only 3 treatments are done: opening an airway and inserting an OPA, applying pressure to stop bleeding, and to some degree elevating an extremity to treat for shock. It's even debatable whether that's even still done in this day and age. Well, if they have a gag reflex, that's good. They're alive. Okay. So it'll make a little more sense in a few minutes. So before starting, as we talked about before, any patient who can walk, have them get up and move to a designated area, whether it's next door's parking lot, across the street, in front of a store or a schoolyard, whatever. Anybody who can get up and walk and follow your commands are automatically considered priority 3, your lowest priority. Move them over, get them out of the way. Maybe you can even get some of them to help you out with simple treatment. They will be rescreened as the subsequent units come on scene. But for right now, get them out of your way. Those are your green tags, your lowest priority. That leaves you priority 1, 2, and 4. So you already got that out of your way. Okay, step 1, assess their respirations. If the patient is not breathing, you make one attempt to open up that airway. And we don't do head tilt chin lifts because, we don't do modified jaw thrust because that would tie up too many resources. Make one attempt, open up the airway, put it in an adjunct if they tolerate it. If they have a gag reflex, then that's great, and that means they're breathing. But if they don't respond and if they don't start breathing spontaneously, once you open up that airway, they are considered in arrest. They are considered dead. That person has been written off. It's cold, it's logical, sounds heartless, but again, we're going with trying to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So you would designate them as what we call a black tag, off to the morgue. If the patient is breathing, then you look at their rate. And then again, now remember we told you never go by just the rate when you're assessing a patient's adequacy of breathing? Well, now we're breaking the rules. In an MCI, it goes strictly on rate. You get less than 30 per minute, move on and evaluate their circulation. If they're hyperventilating, if they're breathing more than 30 times a minute, then they're already automatically priority 1, red tag. All right, we got to get them evaluated and triaged, treated, and transported quickly. Now, I know there's a lot of different things that can cause an elevated respiratory rate. They could just be excited. They could just be hyperventilating. They could just be freaking out. But we don't have the time to make that further assessment right now. We have to move on to all those other patients that are waiting for us to be screened and triaged. So let's say that patient is breathing less than 30 times a minute and has a radial pulse. They have a radial pulse, assess the mental status. If they're breathing less than 30 times a minute and you cannot detect a palpable radial pulse, however, well, remember when you can't detect a radial pulse, what is that a possible sign of? Does anybody know? If you can't detect a palpable radial pulse, that's one of your first signs that, right, Waleed, but basically that they're going into shock, hypoperfusion, okay? There is some debate about the actual numbers, but if they're, most people would agree that if you cannot palpate a radial pulse, there's a good chance they're slipping into shock. Is that a life-threatening, immediate life-threatening condition? Absolutely. So then you put them in the priority 1, red tag. Red means emergency. Okay. So assessing the radial pulse. If the patient has a pulse and is not breathing, he's priority 1. If the patient has a pulse and breathing, she's priority 2. So if they're breathing and they have a radial pulse, they're priority. What does priority 2 mean? It means not walking wounded, but not immediate transport. They can hang around a little bit later. We're going to go over some examples to make it a little more clear. Then assess the mental status. If the patient is alert, well, first I should say if the patient's breathing less than 30, has a radial pulse, and is alert, then they're priority 2. Remember, they're not priority 3 because we already got rid of the priority 3s. We have them sitting over in the bank parking lot. So what do we mean by alert? Not, do you know your name? Do you know what date it is? Who's the president of the United States? I don't know. No, simple. Can you wiggle your fingers? Can you wiggle? Can they follow simple commands? Simple commands, like a dog. Okay, sit, roll over, play dead. Simple as this. Don't have them jump up and down, pat their head, rub their tummy. No, just wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes. Could you do that simple command? If they can follow a simple command, which a lot of EMT students can't do, but if they can do that, then they are considered alert. So if they have a respiratory rate less than 30, if they have a palpable radial pulse, and they are able to follow simple commands, then they are designated priority 2 or yellow tag. If they are breathing less than 30, have a palpable radial pulse, but cannot follow your simple commands, then they are designated priority 1, red tag. Now, what do I mean by green tag, yellow tag, red tag, black tag? Most agencies use these universal screening triage tags to label their patient's condition. There's a whole lot of information on it, but at the very basic level, we're concerned about these 4 colors: black, red, yellow, and green. So as you can see here, black, you know, Domino's and biscuits, amen. If they're black tag, they are deceased. They're in cardiac arrest. We do not work up arrests on MCIs. If they're priority 1, red tag, you see the little bunny rabbit going fast? That is your highest priority. Your priority 2 is your yellow tag. These are the people that can't walk from the scene. Maybe they got bilateral leg fractures or severe external bleeding that's not leading to shock, or whatever the case is. They need treatment, but that can be delayed, hence the picture of the little turtle. And your priority 3 do not even go in the ambulance. They get screened and treated and released at the scene. And that's usually the job of medical control physicians on the scene with other medical personnel as well. So almost every agency uses one form or another of these type of tags. And this is kind of what the protocol looks like. So if you come on the scene, anybody who's walking around, they're minor. They already go out the door. They go across the street and they wait for the next unit to come and reevaluate them. You check their respirations. No respirations, open up the airway, throw in an OPA. If they do not breathe spontaneously, they're black tag, they're deceased. All right. If they start breathing, well, they're already on the floor. So if they start breathing, immediate. Don't have to count, don't have to, just immediate. Okay, because obviously they weren't breathing before you opened up the airway. Mental status and circulation, we're not even going to worry about right now. You make that initial assessment. They do have spontaneous respirations. Are those respirations over 30 a minute? If so, they're immediate transport. I don't care what else is going on. I don't care if they're talking about the latest Yankee game score. If they're breathing more than 30 times a minute for the purpose of MCI, I know this is kind of hard to break, it's hard to absorb, hard to digest. Their immediate transport red tag. If they're breathing under 30 a minute, check their perfusion. Best way to check their perfusion, do they have a radial pulse? Absent radial pulse, or some instances absent less than 2-second capillary refill. That's not really a good assessment tool in an adult. Okay, control the bleeding, and they are immediate transport. If they do have a radial pulse, check their mental status. Cannot follow simple commands, immediate transport. Can follow simple commands, then they are yellow tag and they are delayed transport. So oncoming units will go and re-triage the walking wounded. They'll reassess all patients who walked into the designated area using the same 3 steps. Just because somebody was stable enough to be a green tag 10 minutes ago doesn't mean they couldn't be decompensating now. But as the initial screeners, we're not concerned about that. We're just concerned about the initial triage of each patient and moving on. All right. So assignment of available personnel to equipment to priority 1 patients first. That'll usually be the job of the treatment officer. Transport decisions based on the transport officer will be based on the patient's priority, resources, and destination. So let's go over a few examples of how this works. So you have a 35-year-old man complaining of bruising and swelling to the right arm. Patient is alert and ambulatory. What priority is he? Or do you need to reassess? You want to take a stab at it? Bruising and swelling. Well, Jazeera, that's not, you're kind of right, but that's not a designation. It's priority 1, 2, or 3, or 0, or 4. Very good. Priority 3, green tag, because he's walking wounded. Let's move on. 75-year-old male found on the ground with obvious bilateral tib-fib fractures. You're all saying 2, but do we have enough information to make that assessment? No. Do we know about his mental status? Do we know about his perfusion? Do we know about his respirations? So quick to jump the gun. So, patient is alert, breathing 20 times a minute, and has a strong radial pulse. What would you call him now? But yeah, still 2. But now you can say 2. All right, yes, priority 2. Let's go on with this one. We have a 56-year-old female found on the ground. What do we want to check for first? All right. Anybody else? You said respirations? Yeah, I think so, Ethan. Patient is not breathing spontaneously. So what's a priority? You all say priority 1? Uh-huh. Well, do we do anything yet? Do we have to do anything before making that designation? All right, open up that airway. So after manual positioning of an airway and insertion of OPA, patient begins to breathe spontaneously. What do we do now? Pull the OPA out? So let's think about this. If somebody actually lets you put an OPA in them, is their mental status good? No. So we can probably safely say that this person is a priority 1 red tag, can we not? Yeah. Okay, good. Let's see. 22-year-old male found ambulatory but does not follow your directions and appears disoriented. So instead of going to the parking lot across the street, he kind of circles around like he's in his own orbit. Yep. Priority 1 red tag. No reason to assess respirations, no reason to assess the pulse. His mental status is crashing. He's priority 1. All right. 42-year-old male with partial amputation of left leg, minimal bleeding, alert and oriented person, place and time, radial pulse present, respirations of 26. Ethan. Christine. Melody. Ethan. You guys are absolutely right. I fooled you. Nope. Any reason? Why would you say priority 1? Was his respirations over 30? No. Did he have altered mental status? No. That's what I do, Ethan. Anybody who knows me knows that's what I do. Did he have a radial pulse? Yes. So even though he had a grotesque looking injury, according to your triage criteria, he's only priority 2. Now, if he starts bleeding out later on secondary and tertiary, we could up that triage. We could up that priority. But right now, it's priority 2. So don't let me fool you. Don't let me play poker with you. 22-year-old male with burns to the anterior torso, entire left leg. All right. First of all, before even answering that question, can you give me the percentage of body surface area involved? Oh, I threw a curveball at you. The entire left leg and entire anterior torso, Avelia, wrong! Entire left leg, anterior torso. Oh boy, we got to go back and study this, don't we? The whole entire anterior torso, 9 and 9 is 18. Entire leg, 18. What's 18 plus 18? 36, thank you. All right, he's alert and oriented to person, place, and time. Radial pulse present, respiration are 16. Priority 2. A 32-year-old female with no obvious external injuries, alert and oriented to person, place, and time. Radial pulse is present and breathing at 36 times per minute. Wah. Don't get lulled. Priority 1. What made her a priority 1? 36 times per minute. Absolutely. So again, you got to read the whole thing and don't get sidetracked. 16-year-old female found unresponsive pulses and apneic. Oh, you cold-hearted beasts, you. You just want to write her off as dead before doing anything? God, you guys are just cruel. Okay, so you're not telling me you want to make one attempt to reposition the head in hopes that God is glorious and makes this person alive? No, you're just going to write him off. Okay, so you make that one attempt to open up the airway, and after that one attempt, patient remains apneic. Unfortunately, it's a black tag. Priority 0 or far. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. Any questions on this stuff? All right, guys, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll go over the next topic and the last topic. Okay, we're going to bring it on back and talk about a subject that involves unfortunate reality that we live in today, and that's the dealing of terrorism and EMS response to terrorism events. And I'm sure the events of September 11, 2001 are not lost upon anybody. Over 3,000 people died in one shot. Over 300 emergency responders, including police officers, firefighters, and EMS personnel. Um, and those were just deaths that were on the scene as of that day. Each and every day, we lose more and more responders to the after events of September 11th, including exposure to all that toxic debris from that hazardous material incident that we just talked about a few moments ago. And we kind of think of this as the telltale terrorist event of our lifetime, but there were signs of things like this to come that the city was preparing for, the City of Emergency Management. If you go back to 1995, you look at the. Oh, is anybody having a hard time hearing me still? Waleed can't hear me. Is everybody else not hearing me?
I'm hearing you.
Nope. Sorry, Waleed, it's you. In any event, in about 1995, there was an incident in Tokyo, Japan, set off by this religious cult leader. Don't even ask me to pronounce his name, but the purpose of his cult was to try to hasten out the end of the world. And so what they did is they devised a way to uh, put sarin-laced bombs into 5 different subway lines. And for those of you who don't know what sarin is, it's a very poisonous, toxic nerve agent gas that is lethal to death to massive amounts of people in just the smallest doses. And the plan was to have all these packages pierced with umbrellas on the train, have these trains carrying the sarin gas at a central hub, and kill millions and billions, thousands and thousands of people. It ultimately failed in the way that it didn't deliver the fatalities that they were hoping for, but there were still many, many casualties. And not only were there casualties in the subway system, but many of the casualties affected by this gas were medical personnel who were contaminated by individuals who were brought into those ERs that were not decontaminated on the scene and had no idea what was going on. People who had absorbed this material into the system had a process of what's called off-gassing. The chemical was introduced into their respiratory passages, their eyes, their ears, their nose, and to the point where it became ingrained into their chemistry, and they were actually breathing off the sarin gas and having these vapors come off their bodies, exposing and contaminating medical personnel as well, which led to the shutdown of many medical facilities. It was and this was the first event that really kind of made the US government take the possibility of sarin gas attacks and terrorist attacks seriously. Shortly thereafter, the city, in conjunction with the federal government, hosted a drill of a mock terrorist attack using deadly agents, we call weapons of mass destruction, and all agencies volunteered to participate in police, fire department, EMS. They had no idea what the training drill was about. That was the point of the drill. But it was determined that after the drill was played out, that the first 200 responders would have died instantly before even knowing what was going on. That's how ill prepared we were, and to some degree still are, to these type of events. 1995 Oklahoma City bombing involving about 96, I believe, fatalities from homegrown domestic terrorists. You can see the picture on the right that made the cover of Time of a firefighter carrying a dead child out of the building that hosted a daycare center. Many federal employed people working at that time, the day. No, Jones, that was not a work of the Unabomber. That was work of a right-wing militia group that was upset with what happened about a year prior in this religious cult in Waco, Texas. Uh, David Koresh, the Branch Davidians. That was in response to that. Then very shortly, right after 9/11, New York City saw an Oh yes, that's another incident of terrorists as well. The Unabomber as well, another domestic terrorist. And what happened very shortly thereafter in New York City was these attacks using a biological agent, anthrax, which is a bacterial pathogen that can cause uh, uh, system-wide organ failure and death. And of course, with everything going on at 9/11, it was thought to have been uh, some type of rogue overseas religious cult or group of terrorists like Al Qaeda responsible for this. And ultimately, years later, it was found to be homegrown domestically by a former infectious disease specialist that was employed by the U.S. military. Um, the kind of an interesting thing is the not only the physical damage that this incident caused, it was about 8 fatalities, I think. Maybe my numbers are off a little bit, but how the fright and the fear and the paranoia involved with these attacks really shut down the city for a number of days and weeks following ahead of time. So let's go about and define the term terrorism: a violent act dangerous to human life to intimidate or coerce a government, a civilian population, or any segment thereof in further of political or social objective. Um, it usually involves the use of trying to inflict as many casualties as efficiently as possible, and it's usually done so by using any one of these what's called weapons of mass destruction. And these could be just armed attacks with typical firearms, chemical agents, such as we spoke about, the sarin gas, biological agents, such as the anthrax, radiological and nuclear agents, which are not as common, or just by basically conventional explosive weapons as well. The bottom line is the goal is to try to kill as many people in a shortest amount of time as possible, and in doing so by trying to promote some type of agenda. Now, reason why terrorism awareness is so important, because you got to always remember that first responders like yourselves may always be the targets of terrorism. Never compromise your own safety during an incident. We lost too many EMS personnel that day on 9/11 because we were ill prepared and because of, I hate to say, mismanagement on the scene. All right. So, what makes a situation more likely to be um, involved in a terrorist incident? Well, you need to look at things like occupancy and location, symbolic historic targets like the White House, IRS office, New York Stock Exchange, anything that can significantly disrupt the nation's ability to function day to day. Public buildings and assembly areas like shopping malls and convention centers. Think about what would happen if in mainstream America, your local shopping mall on a typical early Sunday afternoon gets ransacked by a terrorist-induced explosion or dirty bomb. It's gonna not only is the initial event going to cause fear and panic, but it's also going to be very disruptive to the economy. How many people are going to go out and spend their money in shopping malls and continue building up the nation's economy? It has a somewhat of a trickle down effect when you think about it. Timing events can be very significant. National holidays like the 4th of July, where they always have large social gatherings, anniversaries of other terrorist events. Every the year thereafter, after 9/11, there's always a heightened security for another terrorist attack to try to basically, I don't know, cause some type of psychological rubbing it in your face type incident. Luckily, there's never been anything to that degree, but you never know. You basically, your most primary targets are places of huge occupations of large crowds, like stadiums, um, places of mass gathering, like Times Square, significant places of government dealings, like the White House, places that like the Indian Point nuclear plant, which has just recently gone through the final stages of being shut down. But until this point, there's still other nuclear power plants in the country. They say it's pretty much safe from terrorist attacks, but you never know. What are some of the scenes, the warning signs that something may have occurred? Well, check out these unexplained patterns of illness. If you're going to get a biological attack, you're not going to see it right away. First people that are probably going to see it are your EMS dispatchers that are sending ambulance on calls for the same type of illness in different parts of the city. For example, if something was released at the New York Stock Exchange, like some type of viral or biological pathogen, it's unlikely that the effects are going to be seen right then and there that day of exposure. These people are going to go home, they're going to go out their day, and then over the next day or two, they're going to start succumbing to these illnesses in all different areas. So that could be very difficult to trace. Chemical containers found on the scenes, unusual items at locations like knapsacks that don't belong there, fires of unusual behavior, things that just tend to flash over way too quickly than a normal fire would, leading to the suspicion that some type of accelerant was used. Different types of weapons will have different types of effects. There's your biological weapons like the anthrax, nuclear weapons, not so uncommon, not so likely, but still can't discount it. Incendiary weapons like Molotov cocktails, chemical weapons, which are really the kind of go-to concern, and conventional explosives as well. Incendiary weapons, you probably see them more often than not involving propane bombs, shaped charges, may disseminate into other weapons, so things that release fire, and then release chemicals which can accelerate the fire, like acid bombs. These are kind of like your poor man's weapons of mass destruction. Responding to explosive incidents, where bombs will vary in different sizes, from pipe bombs to car bombs. You always have to have the thought of suicide bomber on board. Like what happened at Penn Station last year around Christmas time. You had a potential suicide bomber. His plan screwed up totally. He wound up only setting himself on fire. Any conventional bomb could always be laced with chemical or biological agents. That's the one thing to be deathly concerned about. And these are the most frequent weapons used by terrorists, whether international or domestic. The big take-home point here is to always be cautious of secondary devices. And secondary devices are meant to kill you. So think about what happened with the Boston Marathon. You had an initial device go off, which still killed about 3 people. And then about 15 seconds later, which was probably a little sooner than they wanted it to, a second device went off. The second device is meant to go off after the emergency personnel respond to the incident and take out the rescue personnel as well. So that's why these are the situations where it's okay to not put your foot on that accelerator pedal. It's okay to not be a hero, to stay back and let the specialty trained boys, the FBI, the military get on the scene beforehand. Because at the end of the day, they got the big bucks training that we don't necessarily have. So biological incidents, we've already saw it in New York City with the anthrax attacks. Very rarely will have a focused emergency or one point of origin. That's usually not how it works unless there's been some kind of spread of something that works really quickly. But most of the times, biological agents are not really easy to obtain. They're not really easy to contain. They're not easy to obtain. They're also not easy to contain. So terrorists tend to have a difficult time weaponizing these agents. The anthrax attacks that occurred in 2001 were ultimately military-grade anthrax that was spread by a former military agent, a contractor. Um, Really, I'm not sure what his motivation really was, but this was very specialized material that really is only found in the United States and Russia. Uh, More often, you'll see public health emergencies that have sudden demand on public health with no apparent explanation. So what happened? About a week or two after 9/11, someone in Florida came down with cutaneous anthrax that affected his finger. Red flags went up, but seemed to be an isolated incident. Then another incident in Jersey, and then another couple of incidents in New York City. And then all of a sudden, we started seeing a pattern. And then a pattern's followed by these envelopes followed with containing white powder and messages. These was all red herrings to kind of let us think that it was international when it was really one individual doing all of this. Different kind of biological agents include bacteria, which can live outside of the host cell, and something like anthrax, which is a bacterial agent, is very, very difficult to destroy or disinfect. It's a spore-forming bacteria. It can survive many, many different types of cleaning agents like bleach and peroxide. Once it's in the system, it's not overall that difficult to treat with antibiotics. However, it has to be identified first. And most of the people that died from anthrax poisoning only presented with very flu-like symptoms until about 3 or 4 days into it, they took a drastic turn for the worse. Viruses are harder to produce and they cannot survive outside of the host cell. But they can be tricky and they can mutate very quickly, as you've already can tell with the recent COVID incident. Toxins are not actually living products, but they're poisons produced by living products, such as your tetanus toxoid, which can cause paralyzation of the respiratory muscles, or ricin, which is a product of the castor bean, which can cause disruption of all epithelial tissue and end organ damage and complete system shutdown. So going back to the anthrax attacks back in 2001, you had about a few incidences of cutaneous anthrax where exposure to this bacteria caused thickening dead eschar like charred scarring of the skin, again treated by antibiotics. And then you had about 5 cases of death due to inhalational anthrax, where the anthrax spores were inhaled, introduced into the body, into the lungs, introduced into the lymphatic system, where they were able to germinate and reproduce, and then seed the rest of the body, causing system-wide organ failure. Now, the thing again about these type of attacks are, you had about 5 fatalities from these anthrax attacks. Any day in the week, you'll have an overturned bus in the Midwest where twice the number of people will die in one shot. If anybody remembers the bus that overturned on the Hutchinson Parkway a few years ago in the Bronx, about 20 fatalities where the bus just got sliced in half. That made the front page news and then made a couple of headlines afterwards, and people forgot about it. What happened with these anthrax attacks, however, is that you had just a few fatalities, which is a few too many, obviously. But what happened? You had post offices shutting down. You had celebrity TV shows shutting down and leaving New York. You had banks closing. You had government offices shutting down. You've had the whole shutdown of everything that causes this government to work. And that's exactly what was intended. I was actually working in the ambulance in the Midtown, and Lenox Hill Hospital was offering free testing to employees of the eye and ear infirmary whose one of the employees suffered a fatality from anthrax. And the lines were spiraling around the block, and people were getting into fistfights for cutting into the lines with each other. That's how out of control the situation had gotten at some point. So some of the other things we worry about are things like smallpox, which is supposed to have been eradicated from the world. However, there is still military-grade smallpox in 2 places, in the military complexes in the United States and the former Soviet Union, which is non-existent anymore. And there's big concerns that the experimental military grade smallpox that used to be in the Soviet Union was now no longer accounted for, because all those scientists that were employed by the government at that time were now out of a job. So that's a little bit of a scary situation. And here's a situation that occurred. The Bulgarian journalist named Georgy Markov makes for an actual true spy thriller. He was a journalist who wrote many anti-Soviet rhetoric in newspapers, and it was determined that he was assassinated one day by getting just poked in the skin by the tip of an umbrella. This umbrella was laced with ricin, which again is a chemical agent found, a natural agent found in the castor bean, and which quickly causes every single organ system to just shut down and die. Junsuk, I really don't know what that's supposed to. Let's keep politics out of the classroom, okay? Um, Hello? Now, there's obviously concern about, especially in the political world, about a nuclear bomb going off, and this has been uh, propagated by TV, movies, and stuff like that. The chances of a nuclear bomb detonating on the mainland United States is actually still very slim. You can see the horrific effects of radiation from what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a little more recently with the Chernobyl incident that occurred in the mid 80s, a reactor meltdown. Um, so it's unlikely to occur that a nuclear device would be detonated in the United States. However, it's not unlikely that a what's called dirty bomb um, may be detonated. In other words, a conventional explosive laced with radioactive material. And that's really not far-fetched, because where do you think radioactive materials are found? Found everywhere. If you go into the science building, they're in the science labs. If you go to your local dentist office, they're in their imaging equipment. If you look in your own smoke detectors, there's radioactive material. It's all over the place. Just the Earth itself is radioactive. It's not out of the realm of possibility that someone who's very astute in engineering and this type of material can whip up a batch of something that's radioactive, get some conventional explosives, and let it loose. And again, think about the psychological aspects that can occur if you're spending a day out in Citi Field and a dirty bomb gets exploded on Citi Field at a typical Mets game. Well, fortunately, because not too many people like the Mets, there'd be very few casualties to begin with. But theoretically, though, it would cause a lot of psychological backlash, and many people would wind up probably avoiding baseball games and sporting events altogether, which would have a trickle down effect on the psyche of the country and the economic structure and just the lifestyle of the country to begin with. So just something to think about as far as that goes. And just different types of radiation. There's alpha particles, beta particles, gamma particles. Gamma particles will not turn you into a 7-foot, 400-pound hulking beast that fights the Avengers. No, but they will penetrate your body quite easily and poke holes in your DNA, causing mutations and usually uh, various forms of cancer and other radiation-related illnesses. Alpha particles and beta particles in themselves are generally not that dangerous unless they get ingested or absorbed. They're usually blocked by thin sheets of paper, heavy clothing, even your skin. They may cause little external burns, but the gamma particles can only be blocked by thick sheets of lead or heavy concrete. Your best protection in the event of a radiologic incident is time, distance, and shielding. Minimize the time that you're on the scene. Stay as far away as possible. And if you're going to be anywhere near that situation, make sure you're properly trained and properly shielded. And that's pretty much what we just talked about. And as far as dirty bombs goes, this is kind of a, whoops, backtrack a little bit here. Something I just kind of looked up, annual incidents of trafficking and mishandling of nuclear and other radioactive materials reported to U.S. intelligence officials have more than doubled since the early 1990s, says Director of Domestic Nuclear Detection, Department of Homeland Security. So that's kind of scary. So there's a lot of nuclear material running around out there on the highways and the roads, and a big chunk of it is unaccounted for. So that's why awareness of this stuff is kind of essential. So radiologic warfare is somewhat a possibility. Biological warfare, again, somewhat of a possibility. The big scary thing, though, is an attack using chemical agents, because these materials are very easily made in labs with just a little bit of knowledge in chemistry, little access to the web, and they include things like riot control agents, like tear gas, choking agents, like chlorine gas, cyanides, blistering agents like mustard gas. But what's really scary are these nerve agents, things like sarin and VX and tabun, that really work to poison the nervous system. Now, to remember a little bit about how the nervous system works and how these agents work, a lot of nerves, all nerves, work on the use of chemical messengers, like a quarterback throwing a pass to the receiver and the receiver making the play and hitting the end zone. So when one nerve wants to communicate with another nerve, an electrical signal travels down this. Do I have the pointer on? Electrical signal travels down the nerve, stimulates the end of the nerve to release a chemical neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That's a very, very common neurotransmitter. That acetylcholine travels across the space between the nerves called the synapse and attaches to a receptor. And once that receptor is attached to, it signals the receiving nerve to start sending a signal and doing whatever the receiving nerve or muscle or gland, whatever the target organ is, to do its thing. Now that acetylcholine, some of it is taken back up into the presynaptic nerve to regulate its amount, and some of it is destroyed by an enzyme that destroys it called acetylcholinesterase. And it's important to have this balance. So let's say you're cruising up and down through Manhattan, cruising maybe a word we would want to use, but navigating the traffic in Manhattan, you're constantly accelerating and braking and accelerating and braking, and that's what your nervous system is doing. One nerve is sending off acetylcholine, the other nerve is sending off enzymes to degrade the acetylcholine, so not too much is flooded. Now, what many of these nerve agents, like sarin, tabun, VX, do is they destroy the acetylcholinesterase. So now you have nothing inhibiting the overflow or the flooding of acetylcholine from one nerve to the other. And that's how you wind up getting this syndrome of what's called a cholinergic crisis or cholinergic poisoning. And you can remember these symptoms by remembering this acronym, SLUDGEM. SLUDGEM. Don't you love that word? It sounds for salivation, which is excessive drooling, lacrimation, excessive tearing, urination, excessive pee-pee, defecation, pooping all over themselves, GI distress, meaning severe abdominal pain, emesis, vomiting, and muscle twitching. Muscle twitching that can be so violent and so severe, a person can wind up disjointing themselves. I don't really advocate education by Hollywood, but if you ever watch the movie The Rock, it's a pretty good movie actually, with Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery back in the 1990s. Kind of gives a little good idea about how effective these agents are. No, you're not going to stab yourself in the heart with an auto-injector, but we do want to learn about a couple of other drugs used in these situations to kind of handle the situation. So you've learned about a number of different drugs in pharmacology. There are two other drugs you're going to be learning about. One is called atropine, and the other is called 2-pralidoxamine, or 2-PAM for short. What atropine does, if we go back to that previous slide, I'm not going to get into the whole protocol about it because you'll learn that in a later time when you're out in the field. Atropine actually blocks the receptor for the acetylcholine. So you have all this acetylcholine being flooded into the other nerve. Atropine is kind of like that defensive back that's blocking the reception, attenuating or slowing down the effect of that flooding acetylcholine. 2-pralidoxamine, or 2-PAM for short, helps reestablish that acetylcholine enzyme, acetylcholine esterase. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole, most regional protocols like New York City, Nassau, have a whole guideline of, a cocktail of how many atropines versus how many 2-PAMs. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing in this class. But a very typical plan would be for in EMTs to administer these drugs to patients who have been decontaminated prior to being brought out into the cold zone. A certain number of EMTs would be overseen by a single paramedic. A certain number of paramedics would be overseen by the medical control physician. The paramedics would be responsible for the atropine and the 2-PAM, as well as administering Valium for seizures. And again, once again, that this is only done in the cold zone. So in the hot zone where the actual exposure took place, you would have your specially trained rescue hazmat specialists going in there with their level 1 Tyvek suits and self-contained breathing apparatus, going in there looking for any possible survivors. And the way they triage for survivors is basically giving them a small kick and seeing if they twitch or respond. If they twitch or respond, they get brought out into the warm zone to be decontaminated. If there's no response at all, they're basically black tagged. In the warm zone, they do whatever steps they need to decontaminate, grossly decontaminate, by showering them down, scrubbing them down, and then only once they're deemed safe enough to be out in the cold zone can they be treated with these agents and then transported to the emergency rooms. So when considering your response to a potential terrorist incident, it's really important to reiterate the necessity to safeguard yourself. Determine the severity of the danger, control the scene if you can, size it up. If you see a bunch of people running out of an office building, choking and gagging, and seeing a couple of dead birds in front of the lawn and they're screaming to you for help, don't go and investigate. Put the ambulance in reverse and floor the gas. Textbook says to isolate the hazard area. Yeah, you could do that from a distance, if at all. I mean, these are very, very textbook guidelines that don't meet a lot of practicality for the basic EMT. Notify your dispatch and let the dispatch notify the proper agencies like law enforcement, Center for Disease Control, emergency services units, okay? These are the big boys. These are what they get paid for do. They're the ones that should go in and take control of the situation. It's okay for you guys to sit back and be second string or third string or even play water boy. It may not always be possible to identify the material, but do not try to endanger yourself in the process. Most of these situations are going to be hazardous materials situations, but not by accident. Remember, these are crime scenes. And there are crime scenes until proven otherwise. You don't necessarily know if it's a terrorist attack or not initially, but most terrorist attacks have properties in common with every other MCI and hazmat material. So your approach is pretty much the same, just keeping yourself safe. And remember that responders may be targets. Remember the secondary devices, that's always a possibility. Always go over your standard operating procedures and protocols and never compromise your own safety. And my words, when in doubt, just get the hell out. And that's basically in memory of all those lost on 9/11. Any question about tonight's material? I'm going to turn off the record button.